And finally, Mark beamed from the stage, his arm outstretched towards me. I have to thank my amazing wife, Sarah, for being my biggest cheerleader. I walked up the steps, the applause echoing in the crowded room. He expected me to just stand beside him and smile, the dutiful wife. Instead, I took the microphone from his hand. The room went quiet. "Thank you, Mark," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm so glad everyone is here, because as the 100% owner and sole financier of Heartland Investments, the parent company of MCore Solutions, I have an announcement to make." The look on his face, pure shock, followed by a wave of cold panic. He had no idea what was coming, but that explosion was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years, all starting with a single, belittling comment. That belittling comment at the craft fair wasn't a thunderclap. It was more like the steady, maddening drip of a leaky faucet in the middle of the night. You try to ignore it, tell yourself it's just a small thing, but eventually, it's the only sound you can hear, the sound that hollows you out from the inside. "It's great she has this little hobby to keep her busy." He said it with a big, proud husband smile plastered on his face, patting my shoulder like I was a golden retriever who'd just learned to roll over. The woman he was talking to, a potential customer, just gave me a tight, pitying look before buying 2 jars of my peach bourbon jam. She knew. Women always know. That night, long after the house fell into the deep, quiet breathing of sleep, that comment was still ringing in my ears. The world saw Mark as the go-getter, the founder of MCore Solutions, a man wrestling with spreadsheets and chasing venture capital. And me? I was just Sarah, the supportive wife with the cute little jam business. The one who made sure the kids' permission slips were signed and the fridge was stocked with organic milk. The one with the hobby? But my hobby didn't end when the craft fair packed up. My real work started when the rest of the world clocked out. I slipped out of bed, the floorboards cool beneath my feet, and crept not to the kitchen, but to the garage. Mark thought it was just a mess of old furniture and holiday decorations. He never came out here. It was my sanctuary, my factory, my headquarters. The air hung thick and sweet with the ghosts of yesterday's peaches and the sharp tang of sterilizing vinegar. In the moonlight filtering through the dusty window, stacks of cardboard boxes stood like skyscrapers, branded with the Heartland Jams logo I had designed myself. Shipping labels to addresses in Oregon, Florida, and Texas were curled and ready on a folding table. This wasn't a hobby. It was a full-scale, coast-to-coast operation, a secret empire built on sugar and pectin. My grandmother, Eliza, was the original jam maker. She was a woman born from Dust Bowl resilience who believed that a full pantry was the only true form of wealth. She left me her recipe book, a worn, leather-bound journal with spidery, elegant handwriting, and a trust fund she had built by quietly playing the stock market with a shrewdness that would have made Wall Street wolves blush. "Never let a man be your only plan, Sarah Jane," she'd told me, her hand cool and papery on mine. "Have your own garden, your own soil." Her legacy was my secret weapon. Mark knew about the inheritance, of course, but he thought it was a modest sum, something to fall back on. He had no idea of its true scale, and I never corrected him. It was my soil. I left the sweet-smelling air of the garage and went to the small, dark office at the back of the house. The room smelled of dust and old paper, a forgotten corner of the home we'd built together. I sat down in the worn-out ergonomic chair I'd bought at a garage sale and woke up the old desktop computer. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow on my face. My fingers found the keys, typing in a password that was a combination of my grandmother's birthday and the name of her favorite rosebush. The banking website loaded. My personal checking account had $437.52 in it, enough for groceries and maybe a new pair of sneakers for my son. Then, with another click, I opened the other account, the one Mark didn't know about, Eliza's Trust. The balance glowed on the screen, a number so large it looked like a typo. $1,847,219.34. It was the result of a lifetime of my grandmother's quiet wisdom and my own careful stewardship. It was my freedom, my security, and, for the last 3 years, it had been the silent, uncredited investor in my husband's dream. I clicked on the Transfers tab. My hands felt heavy. I remembered the night Mark came to me, his face pale with panic. His first round of funding had fallen through. "It's over, Sarah," he'd said, his voice cracking. Everything I've worked for. It's all gone. I saw the terror in his eyes, the fear of a man who'd built his entire identity on the idea of being a provider, a success. And in that moment, my heart broke for him. "We're a team," I'd said, taking his hand. "I've got you." So I made the first transfer. A lifeline, then another to cover payroll, then one for a new server, then another for a marketing push. Each time, it was a crisis. Each time, I was the anonymous savior. He'd come home, jubilant. "You're not going to believe it, babe. An anonymous angel investor came through. Someone out there really believes in me." He never once asked if that angel investor was sleeping in the bed next to him. He didn't want to know. It would have ruined the story he was telling himself, the one where he was the self-made man, the hero of his own epic. My cursor hovered over the transfer fields, from Eliza's Trust to M-Core Solutions LLC. The name he'd chosen, so cold and corporate, had always bothered me. It had none of the heart, none of the soul, that I poured into Heartland Jams. Amount: $15,000. I typed it in, the numbers feeling like tiny weights on my soul. Memo: monthly operating. I clicked confirm. A small box popped up. "Are you sure you want to make this transfer?" My whole life, I'd been a good girl. I followed the rules. I kept the peace. I supported my husband. But staring at that question on the screen, I felt a flicker of something else. A cold, hard anger. He was out there, building a company on my grandmother's legacy, and publicly calling my own life's work a little hobby. I thought about the new delivery van I needed, the commercial-grade kitchen I dreamed of. All of it put on hold, so his dream could have oxygen. My finger trembled over the mouse. I could just not. I could close the laptop, go back to bed, and watch what happened. Let the chips fall. Let the self-made man see what he was really made of. But then I saw my children's faces in my mind. The life he provided, the stability. It was all built on this lie. On me. My sacrifice was the foundation of our entire world. With a deep, shaky breath, I clicked. "Your transfer has been scheduled." The numbers on the screen changed. The balance in Eliza's Trust shrank. I watched the lifeblood of my independence, my grandmother's hard-won legacy, flow away into the cold, sterile account of M-Core Solutions. I closed the laptop, and the blue light vanished, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, and the steady, maddening drip, drip, drip of resentment in my own heart. That drip of resentment didn't fade with the morning light. It was a cold, hard knot in the pit of my stomach as I stood in the kitchen packing lunches. Peanut butter and jelly for my son, turkey and provolone for my daughter. I cut the crusts off both, a small act of love that felt automatic, robotic. Mark breezed through, grabbing a protein bar and kissing the top of my head. "Big day, babe. Wish me luck," he said, already halfway out the door, the scent of his expensive cologne lingering in the air like a taunt. I didn't say anything, just wiped a smear of jelly off the counter with my thumb. My luck, I thought, was parked in the driveway. My car was a 2012 Honda Odyssey, and that's the most generous description I can give it. It was less a vehicle and more a mobile monument to motherhood. Its silver paint was dull under a permanent film of dust, and its right side bore a magnificent dent, a deep, sweeping crescent moon courtesy of a runaway shopping cart at Costco 2 years ago. Mark had promised we'd get it fixed, but then M-Core needed a new server rack, and somehow my dent became a permanent part of the car's personality, a battle scar. The inside was worse. The air was a potent cocktail of stale goldfish crackers, forgotten gym socks, and the faint, sickly sweet smell of a juice box that had leaked under the passenger seat last summer. The upholstery was a Jackson Pollock of mysterious stains. The steering wheel, my central command, was worn smooth and was starting to crack and peel, a constant, rough reminder of the thousands of miles I'd driven between school, soccer practice, and the grocery store. This van wasn't just a car, it was the skin I lived in, and it was starting to fall apart. "Mom, can you turn on my music?" My daughter called from the third row as I backed out of the driveway. I fumbled with the radio, which had a habit of resetting itself every few days. The car gave a lurch as it shifted gears, a jarring, unhealthy-sounding clunk that made my stomach tighten. It had been doing that for weeks. I'd mentioned it to Mark. "Just get it checked out," he'd said, his eyes glued to his phone, already mentally at the office. As I merged onto the main road, my phone buzzed, connecting to the car's crackly Bluetooth. The caller ID flashed on the tiny dashboard screen, Dave's Auto. My heart sank. I dropped the car off yesterday for an oil change and asked him to look into the clunking sound. "Hey, Sarah, it's Dave." His voice boomed, staticky but cheerful. Dave had been fixing my car since I was 16 and driving my dad's old pickup truck. He was a good man who never tried to upsell me on blinker fluid. "Hey, Dave, please don't tell me it's bad news," I said, trying to sound breezy. "Well, it ain't good news," he said, his tone shifting. "The oil change is done, but that clunking you're hearing, your transmission's slipping, the solenoid pack is shot. We can replace it, but I gotta be honest with you, Sarah, it's not gonna be cheap." I braced myself, my knuckles white on the peeling steering wheel. "How not cheap are we talking?" There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. "Parts and labor, you're looking at around $1,200, maybe a little more. $1,200. The number hung in the air, thick and impossible. My mind did a dizzying, sickening calculation. I pictured the screen from last night, the $15,000 I had transferred without a second thought. I could pay for this repair 12 times over and still have money left. I had nearly $2 million sitting in an account with my name on it. And yet, the words that came out of my mouth were the words of a woman who was broke. "Oh," I said, my voice small. "Wow. Okay. I know. It's a lot," Dave said, his sympathy making it even worse. "We can hold off on it if you need to. It's not going to explode or anything, but it's not going to get better on its own either. It'll just get worse." I could feel my kids listening from the back seat. I had to be the responsible one, the mom who made sensible, tough decisions. I couldn't just say, "No problem, Dave, I'll write you a check," because that's not who I was supposed to be. I was the hobbyist, the jam maker, the woman whose husband was the breadwinner. My secret was a cage I had built myself, and now I was rattling its bars. To use that money for myself, for something as mundane and necessary as a car repair, would be a betrayal of the role I had agreed to play. It would mean admitting that Mark's dream wasn't the only one that mattered. "You know what, Dave," I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "Let's just hold off for now. I'll have to wait a few weeks, maybe next month." "You got it, Sarah. Just let me know. Be careful with it, okay?" "I will, thanks, Dave." I hung up. The silence in the car was heavy. Even the kids seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The worn-out van suddenly felt less like a familiar comfort and more like a coffin on wheels. It was a physical manifestation of my life. On the outside, I was holding everything together, but on the inside, the gears were slipping, grinding themselves down, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing just stopped working. I looked at my hands on the wheel. The hands that packed lunches and signed permission slips, but also the hands that had built a business from scratch and were secretly funding another. These hands were capable of so much, yet here I was, choosing to drive a car that could break down at any moment because I was too afraid to claim what was rightfully mine. That cold knot of resentment in my stomach began to burn. That cold knot of resentment didn't just burn, it settled deep inside me, a solid, heavy stone in my gut. It was still there a week later. A silent passenger as I drove my clunking, wounded minivan to Mark's sister's house for their annual 4th of July barbecue. The irony was suffocating. I was driving a car held together by hope and prayer to celebrate the nation's independence, while feeling more trapped than I ever had in my life. Chloe's house was the anti-Honda Odyssey. It was a modern architectural marvel of glass and steel, with a lawn so green and meticulously manicured it looked like a CGI rendering. The air smelled of chlorine from the saltwater pool and expensive charcoal from a grill the size of a small car. Kids, not mine, were laughing and shrieking as they ran through a state-of-the-art sprinkler system. It was the American dream, polished to a high-gloss, Instagram-ready finish. And in the middle of it all was Mark, king of the cul-de-sac, tongs in one hand, a bottle of craft IPA in the other, holding court. He was in his element, laughing, telling some exaggerated story about a deal he almost closed, flipping burgers with a theatrical flair. I spent the first hour in my usual role, the support staff. I laid out the salads I'd spent the morning making, organized the paper plates and napkins, and made sure the kids were slathered in sunscreen. I was a ghost in the machine of the party, a series of helpful hands and a quiet smile, ensuring the whole production ran smoothly. No one ever noticed the stage manager. They only see the star of the show. After getting the kids settled with hot dogs, I made a plate for Mark. A perfectly cooked cheeseburger, a scoop of my potato salad, his favorite, and a handful of chips. I navigated the crowd on the patio, a minefield of small talk and polite smiles, and made my way to the grill. He was deep in conversation with Chloe. Chloe was everything I wasn't. While I was in a faded sundress and worn-out sandals, she was dressed in a crisp, white linen pantsuit that probably cost more than my transmission repair. Her hair was a sleek, architectural bob, and her nails were a perfect, blood-red manicure. She was a senior vice president at some downtown firm, and she wore her success like a suit of armor. She looked at me the way you look at a well-meaning but slightly incompetent temp. "Here you go," I said, holding out the plate to Mark. He glanced at it, then back at Chloe, mid-sentence. "Thanks, babe. Just put it over there," he said, gesturing vaguely with the tongs toward a crowded side table. He didn't make eye contact. I was an interruption, a delivery service. I felt my smile falter, the muscles in my face struggling to hold it in place. I put the plate down, the paper bending under the weight of the food, and turned to walk away, to fade back into the background. But I stopped. Their voices were low, conspiratorial, and I caught the name of Mark's company. I hovered by the drink station, pretending to search for a bottle of water, my back to them, my ears straining. "The numbers for Q2 are solid, but your overhead is still too high," Chloe said, sipping her chilled white wine. Her voice was sharp, clinical. "You're bleeding cash on administrative tasks. You really need to hire a real admin, Mark. A professional. Someone who can actually streamline your books and manage client relations. This next phase is serious." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. A real admin. A professional. She wasn't just talking about a hypothetical employee. She was talking about me. For the past year, I had been the one processing his invoices late at night. I was the one who set up his QuickBooks, who sorted his receipts, who fielded calls from confused clients when he was too busy. I was his unpaid, uncredited, and apparently unreal admin. I waited for Mark to defend me. To say, "Sarah does a great job," or "She's a huge help." I held my breath, bracing for the small, token defense that would at least acknowledge my existence and effort. Instead, I heard him laugh, a short, dismissive chuckle. I know, he said, his voice dropping. "You're right, but she's free. She's free." The stone in my gut turned to ice. The cheerful sounds of the party, the splashing water, the sizzle of the grill, the upbeat pop music from the outdoor speakers all faded into a dull, distant roar. In that moment, the world narrowed to those three words. She's free, free. He had taken my love, my support, my late nights, my grandmother's legacy, the very money that kept his serious business afloat, and boiled it all down to a price tag of 0. He wasn't just taking me for granted, he was defining my worth as nothing. I wasn't an investor. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't even a real admin. I was a line item in his budget that cost him nothing. I felt a wave of dizziness, my hand gripping the edge of the drink cooler to steady myself. I looked down at my own hands, the fingernails short and clean but with the faint, telltale stain of strawberry jam under the edges that never quite scrubbed away. These were the hands that had made him that plate of food. The hands that had transferred $15,000 just days ago. The hands that were currently white-knuckling a cooler full of juice boxes, fighting the sudden, violent urge to turn around and throw a bottle of ketchup at Chloe's pristine white pantsuit. But I didn't. I just stood there, my back to them, frozen. Then I heard them laugh together. A shared, private laugh. The laugh of co-conspirators. The laugh of people who believed they were on the inside, looking out at the rest of the world. And I realized, in that sickening moment, that to them, I was part of that other world. I wasn't on the team. I was a resource to be used. And a free one, at that. Slowly, deliberately, I let go of the cooler. I straightened my back. I turned and walked away from the grill, away from their laughter, and headed toward the far side of the lawn where my kids were playing. I needed to feel the solid ground under my feet. I needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with their casual, soul-crushing cruelty. The slow burn of resentment was gone. In its place, something new was taking root. Something cold and hard and sharp. It wasn't just a hobby anymore. This was business. Business. The word echoed in my mind, clean and sharp, cutting through the fog of hurt and resentment. Business meant looking at the bottom line. It meant assessing assets and liabilities. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to Mark's self-satisfied snores, I realized I'd been miscalculating my own life's ledger for years. I had been logging my love and support on the asset side, when in his books, it was just a way to reduce overhead. The next few weeks, I moved with a new, quiet purpose. I fixed the Honda. I walked into Dave's Auto with a check from my Heartland Jams business account and told him to do the work. The $1,200 felt like the single best money I'd ever spent. Driving home, the engine humming smoothly, the gears shifting without a single lurch, I felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with horsepower. It was the feeling of taking care of myself. It was the feeling of being a reliable vehicle, even if no one else was. That small act of independence felt like a dress rehearsal. The main event came a month later. I was in my garage office late one night, paying my quarterly estimated taxes for the jam business. On a whim, I logged into Eliza's trust. The number on the screen punched the air from my lungs. It had dropped below $1.5 million. In less than a year, Mark's dream had devoured nearly $500,000 of my grandmother's legacy. His monthly operating costs were more like a monthly bonfire of my security. I looked at the statement, at the relentless, one-way flow of funds. $15,000, $20,000, 1 month a staggering $35,000 for emergency hardware upgrades. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. This wasn't a business plan. It was a feeding frenzy. The cold, hard, sharp thing inside me told me it was time to get some answers. This was no longer a marriage issue. This was a shareholder demanding an audit. I printed out the last 6 months of transfers, the black and white numbers, a stark testament to my silent partnership. My hands didn't shake. I walked through the quiet house to his office. His door was ajar, a slice of bright light cutting through the dim hallway. He called it his war room. It was his shrine to himself. One wall was covered in a giant whiteboard scrawled with buzzwords like synergy and scalability. A sleek, ridiculously expensive Herman Miller chair sat behind a desk made from reclaimed barnwood. On the desk, 2 giant monitors glowed. This room, I realized, was probably where that $35,000 had gone. He had headphones on, leaning intently toward one of the screens. I thought he was in a late-night conference call with Asia. Then I heard the distinct sound of digital explosions and the frantic clicking of a mouse. He was playing a video game. My CEO, the man building an empire, was fighting digital aliens at 1 a.m. I knocked softly on the door frame. He jumped, ripping off his headphones. "Geez, Sarah, you scared me. What's up?" His face was flushed with the glow of the screen, his eyes still darting around, tracking enemies that weren't there. "Mark, do you have a minute? I need to talk to you about the MCore financials," I said, my voice even and calm. I held up the papers. He sighed, a great, put-upon exhalation of breath, and swiveled in his chair. "Really? Now? I'm in the middle of a major strategy session." "It'll only take a minute," I said, walking in and placing the printout on his reclaimed barnwood desk. I was just looking over the numbers. The monthly operating costs seemed to be accelerating. They're significantly higher than the initial projections we talked about. I'm just trying to understand the burn rate. He glanced down at the paper, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He didn't even really read it. He just saw what it was. A question. An intrusion. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his hands behind his head in a posture of exaggerated patience. "Babe," he said, and the condescension in that single word was a slap in the face. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. This is the big leagues. We're talking about disrupting an entire industry. You can't just nickel and dime it." "I'm not nickel and diming," I said, my voice still level, a feat of Herculean self-control. "I'm looking at a 40% increase in expenditures over 2 quarters, with no corresponding revenue growth." That's not a sustainable model." He actually scoffed. A short, sharp sound of disbelief. "A sustainable model? Are you listening to yourself?" He spun his chair to face me fully, his expression a perfect blend of pity and irritation. "Don't add to my stress with your jam money spreadsheets, okay? I am out here every single day, trying to build a future for this family. For us. The last thing I need is to come in here and have to justify every line item to you. I'm doing this for us." There it was again, that phrase, "for us." He used it like a shield, a magic spell to deflect any accountability. He was framing my completely valid financial concern as an emotional failing, a lack of faith. He was telling me that my questions were an attack on his dream, and therefore, an attack on our family. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Not as my husband, but as a business partner. And I saw a man who was terrified. He wasn't a wolf of Wall Street. He was a spoiled child, playing with money that wasn't his, who just got asked a question he couldn't answer. He wasn't building a future. He was setting my grandmother's legacy on fire to keep himself warm. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply reached out and picked up my papers from his desk. I folded them neatly in half. The crisp sound of the paper folding was the only sound in the room. "You're right," I said softly. He visibly relaxed, a smug little smile playing on his lips, thinking he'd won. "You have enough to worry about." I turned and walked out of his war room, leaving him to his video games and his delusions of grandeur. Back in my own small, forgotten office, I didn't tear up the papers. I slid them into a new manila folder. On the tab, I wrote in neat, clear letters, Q3 discrepancies. I was no longer his cheerleader, and I certainly wasn't his free admin. I was his biggest investor, and I was about to call in my loan. Calling in a loan requires knowing when the borrower is at their absolute peak, right at that precarious moment when they feel most invincible. For Mark, that peak came 2 months later, in the form of a phone call that made him shout so loud the dog started barking. He burst out of his war room, his face lit up with a manic, triumphant glow I hadn't seen in years. He'd done it. He'd landed the North Star contract. It was the big one, the company maker, the one he'd been chasing for a solid year. It was, he declared, a reason to celebrate. And celebrate we did, at a place called Aria, a restaurant so exclusive you couldn't find a price on the online menu. The kind of place with starched white tablecloths so stiff they could stand on their own and waiters who moved with the silent, unnerving grace of black-clad ghosts. The air was thick with the low murmur of old money and the clinking of silverware that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. It was Mark's vision of success made real, and as I sat there in a dress I'd bought on clearance, I felt like an imposter, a ghost at his feast. Chloe was there, of course, looking like she'd just stepped out of a magazine, a shark in a silk blouse. She and Mark were electric, buzzing with a shared energy, finishing each other's sentences as they recounted the final, dramatic hours of the negotiation. I sat, a quiet island in their sea of victory, tracing the rim of my water glass with my finger. "The key," Mark said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "was the real-time analytics platform. They were blown away by our tech. No one else in the running had anything close. I nearly choked on my water. The real-time analytics platform. That was the $35,000 emergency hardware upgrade." I remembered the panic in his voice, the late-night call telling me the deal would be dead without it. I was the one who sat up until 3 a.m., researching software vendors. I was the one who vetted the security protocols. I was the one who clicked confirm on the single largest transfer I had ever made. He called it our tech, as if it had sprung fully formed from his brilliant mind. He'd forgotten my role so completely, it was as if it never happened. The waiter placed a cheese board between us. On it were 4 slivers of cheese and a tiny, perfect dollop of fig jam, served with a miniature silver spoon. Chloe eyed it. "Oh, that's cute," she said with a little smirk in my direction. A little hobby for the chef. It was a tiny little jab, a flick of the wrist, but it landed right in the old wound. I looked at that minuscule portion of jam, maybe a teaspoon's worth, and thought of the gallons of strawberry rhubarb simmering in my cauldrons in the garage. I thought of the sheer, sticky, back-breaking work of it all. This little dollop was an expensive garnish. Mine was a business. The foundation of this entire expensive evening. Mark raised his champagne flute. The crystal sparkled under the dim, artful lighting. "A toast," he announced, his voice filled with emotion. "To MCore Solutions. We just landed the North Star contract. We're in the big time." Chloe immediately raised her glass, her eyes shining with adoration. "Oh, Mark," she gushed, her voice oozing with theatrical sincerity. "You built this from nothing, all on your own. I am just so incredibly proud of you." From nothing. The words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of my lungs. I saw it all in a flash. The late-night transfers, the spreadsheets, the clunking Honda, the taste of cheap coffee on mornings when I'd been up all night sorting his receipts. I saw my grandmother's face, her kind, wise eyes, and felt a hot, shameful flush of betrayal. I had let them build this lie on her legacy, on her hard-earned soil. I must have gone pale. Because Mark finally turned to me. His victory lap momentarily paused. He clinked his glass against mine. It made a sharp, clear, ringing sound. "See, honey," he said, his voice soft and patronizing, the voice you use on a child who just doesn't understand. "Told you I'd take care of us." And that was it. That was the moment the last, frayed thread of hope and affection and shared history finally snapped. He didn't just erase me. He cast himself as my savior. He was the hero who had provided all of this, the fancy meal, the expensive champagne, the secure future, and I was the lucky, clueless wife who got to come along for the ride. The cheerleader. The hobbyist. The free help. I didn't say a word. I simply looked at him, at his beaming, self-congratulatory face, and I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, just a vast, cold, empty clarity. The slow burn of resentment had forged the stone in my gut into a diamond, hard and sharp and unbreakable. I picked up my own champagne flute. The stem was cool and slender in my hand. I raised it, not to them, but to myself, a silent acknowledgement. They thought this was a celebration. They had no idea they were attending a wake, the wake for the company, and the life they thought was theirs. The drive home from Aria was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of a couple who had just had a fight. It was a clean, empty silence. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, leaving the air washed and still. Mark was humming along to the jazz station, drunk on his own success, oblivious. I just stared out the passenger window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. The diamond in my gut wasn't burning anymore. It was just there. A point of perfect, cold clarity. They thought they were celebrating a beginning. I knew they had just toasted to the end. In the weeks that followed, my life split into two parallel realities. In one, I was still Sarah, the mom, the wife, the hobbyist. I packed lunches. I drove the kids to soccer. I perfected a new recipe for spicy tomato jam. I smiled. I nodded. I played my part so perfectly that no one noticed the change. But in the other reality, the secret one that came to life after midnight, I became a different person. My garage, once just a sweet-smelling factory of fruit and sugar, became my real war room. I didn't just sterilize jars. I sterilized my life, preparing to cut out the infection. My first step was to stop being his free admin and start being his silent majority shareholder. I used my access to MCore's financials not to sort his receipts, but to conduct the audit he should have been doing himself. I printed every bank statement, every expense report, every invoice. I spread them out on my large canning table, the scent of simmering apricots in the air, and I followed the money. It was worse than I thought. The burn rate wasn't just mismanagement, it was a 5-alarm fire of negligence. But the real discovery came when I looked into the corporate credit card Chloe managed, the one for marketing and client relations. I expected to find fancy steak dinners and client gifts. Instead, I found a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to her lavish lifestyle. There were weekly charges from a high-end spa under Client Wellness Initiative. There were receipts from Neiman Marcus and Gucci for what she'd coded as promotional materials. She hadn't just been disrespectful. She had been stealing. Blatantly, arrogantly, stealing from the company I was funding. The company that was, in every legal and financial sense, mine. I took the jam-stained folder labeled Q3 Discrepancies and added a new, much thicker one next to it. Fraud. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head. Never let a man be your only plan. She was right. But she also taught me that if you're going to do something, you do it right. You follow the recipe. No shortcuts. My recipe now required a key ingredient: a lawyer. Not Mark's golf buddy lawyer, but my own. I spent 2 days vetting attorneys online, looking for a shark. I found her in a woman named Jessica Thorne, whose website bio was short, terrifying, and brilliant. One night, the house was deep in sleep. I was in my garage, the familiar glow of the laptop illuminating my face. But instead of an order form for canning jars, the screen was filled with Jessica Thorne's sharp, intelligent features. She was in her own sleek, downtown office, even at this hour. "Let's review, Sarah," Jessica said, her voice crisp and clear through my earbuds. "The LLC, Heartland Investments, was established using funds solely from your inherited trust. MCore Solutions is a wholly owned subsidiary of that LLC. Mark and Chloe were installed as managing partners, but you are the sole member and 100% equity owner. Is that correct?" "Yes," I said. "That's correct." "Good," she said with a thin, satisfied smile. "The LLC operating agreement you had drafted is ironclad. It gives you, as the sole member, the unilateral right to remove managing partners for cause, or for no cause at all. Mark's gross mismanagement is cause. Chloe's activities, however." She paused, pulling up another document on her screen. "This is more than just cause. The receipts you sent me, the coded expenses, this is classic wire fraud. It's not just a firing offense, it's a criminal one." A thrill, cold and powerful, shot through me. "So I can do it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I can remove them." "You can do more than that," Jessica replied. "You can dissolve the company, seize the assets which, to be clear, are already legally yours, and press charges against Miss Chloe. You hold all the cards, Sarah. You just have to decide when you want to play them." Right then, the door from the kitchen creaked open. Mark stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, squinting into the dim light of the garage. "What are you doing out here, hun? It's almost 2 a.m. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of calm. With a single click, I minimized Jessica's face, switching my screen to the Heartland Jam's website editor. He saw a picture of a jar of strawberry jam and a block of text. I pulled out my earbuds and gave him a tired, sweet smile. The smile of the harmless wife with the little hobby. "Oh, you know," I said, my voice light. "Just updating the jam website. Got a big holiday rush coming up." He nodded, satisfied, his brain not even registering the absurdity of me doing web design in the middle of the night. To him, this was my world. Small, sweet, and utterly insignificant. "Okay, well, don't be too long," he said, yawning. "Big day tomorrow." He blew me a kiss and disappeared back into the house, closing the door behind him. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade down the hall. I maximized the screen. Jessica was still there, an unreadable expression on her face. "My apologies," I said. She just shook her head, a glimmer of something that looked like admiration in her eyes. "No apologies needed, Sarah. You handle yourself well." Now, about the launch party. That launch party became the perfect stage. It was Mark's idea, of course. He wanted a public coronation, a victory lap to show the world, and more importantly himself, that he had finally arrived. He booked a space at a downtown tech incubator, a place called The Forge. It was a massive, open-concept warehouse with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and a labyrinth of glass-walled offices where young, bright-eyed entrepreneurs hunched over laptops, dreaming of becoming the next Mark. The air was thick with the scent of ambition and stale coffee. For the party, they'd brought in caterers who served tiny, complicated appetizers on slate trays and poured cheap, bubbly Prosecco into plastic flutes. It was a perfect illusion of success. It looked impressive from a distance, but up close it was flimsy and lacked substance. I walked through the crowded room on Mark's arm, a ghost in a navy blue dress. I smiled. I nodded. I shook hands with local business reporters and potential investors. I played the part of the proud, supportive wife to perfection. Mark was radiant, a human sun pulling everyone into his orbit. He was a master of this universe, weaving through conversations, clapping backs, laughing a little too loudly. He never introduced me as his partner. It was always, "Have you met my wife, Sarah?" An accessory. a footnote to his grand story. I didn't mind. In fact, I preferred it. The less they saw me, the less they would see the end coming. I found a quiet spot near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city lights. I watched him work the room, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie I'd already seen. I knew how it ended. A waiter offered me one of the appetizers, a single raspberry on a cracker with a smear of cream cheese and a dot of what they were calling balsamic glaze, but which looked suspiciously like cheap jam. I politely declined. I knew the difference between a garnish and the real thing. After an hour of mingling, a hush fell over the room as Mark stepped onto a small, makeshift stage at the front. Chloe stood beside the stage, beaming like a proud parent, her arms crossed. "Wow, what a turnout," Mark began, his voice amplified by the microphone, echoing slightly in the vast space. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate this incredible milestone for Core Solutions." He launched into the speech he'd been practicing for weeks. He thanked his mentors. He thanked his early-stage supporters. He told the now familiar, heroic story of the company's founding, the story of grit and hustle, of long nights and burning the midnight oil. He painted a picture of himself as a lone visionary, a man who had wrestled a dream into reality through sheer force of will. "I have to give a special thanks to the one person who has been in the trenches with me from day one, who has managed our finances with a brilliant and steady hand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. My heart gave a stupid, hopeful little flutter. For a split second, I thought, maybe he'll finally see. My sister, our incredible CFO, Chloe. The room erupted in applause. Chloe placed a hand on her heart, feigning modesty. I just stood by the window, my reflection a faint, watery outline against the sparkling city. I felt nothing. The diamond in my gut was perfectly still, perfectly cold. I watched him, and I waited. And finally, he beamed from the stage, his arm outstretched towards me, a grand, magnanimous gesture. "I have to thank my amazing wife, Sarah, for being my biggest cheerleader." He motioned for me to come up. This was it, the final scene in his play. The dutiful wife, brought on stage for a pat on the head, a prop to complete the picture of the successful family man. The applause was polite, scattered. I began to walk toward the stage. The journey from the window to those steps felt 1,000 miles long. Every eye in the room was on me. They saw a quiet, unassuming woman in a simple dress walking toward her triumphant husband. They had no idea they were about to witness a demolition. I walked up the steps, the cheap fabric of my dress swishing around my ankles. The applause echoed in the crowded room. He expected me to just stand beside him and smile. Instead, I walked directly to him and took the microphone from his hand. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, before he recovered, assuming I was going to say a few gushing words of my own. The room went quiet, expectant. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of Prosecco and opportunity. I looked out, not at the crowd, but past them, at the reflection in the dark glass of the window, at the woman who had finally had enough. "Thank you, Mark," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the speakers. It didn't waver. It didn't tremble. It was a voice they had never heard before. "I'm so glad everyone is here," I continued, making eye contact with a few people in the front row, drawing them in. "Because as the 100% owner and sole financier of Heartland Investments, the parent company of Core Solutions, I have an announcement to make." The look on his face. It wasn't just shock. It was a complete system failure. The confident, triumphant CEO vanished, replaced by a man watching a car crash happen in slow motion, a crash in which he was the sole passenger. The name Heartland Investments was a foreign language to him, a string of words that held no meaning. But the tone in my voice, the steel in my spine, the look in my eyes that he understood perfectly. Chloe, standing beside the stage, went rigid, her painted-on smile frozen in a mask of horror. He had no idea what was coming, and that was the most beautiful part of all. The beautiful part wasn't the silence itself, but the sound it replaced. It swallowed the applause, the self-congratulatory toasts, and the years of casual, condescending remarks, leaving behind a perfect, ringing vacuum. In that vacuum, 100 different expressions flickered across the faces in the crowd. Confusion, disbelief, and a delicious, dawning understanding on the faces of a few women in the back. But I wasn't looking at them. My focus was on Mark and Chloe. Chloe's face, usually a carefully constructed mask of corporate poise, had shattered. Her blood-red lips were parted in a silent "oh" of horror. Mark was a statue. His hand still outstretched from his grand gesture, the microphone I'd taken from him suddenly looking heavy and foolish. His brain was visibly trying to catch up, to process the string of words I'd just said: Heartland Investments, parent company, sole owner. They were puzzle pieces from a different box, and they didn't fit into the neat, tidy picture of the world he lived in. I let the silence hang for another beat, letting the weight of it press down on them. I had practiced this moment in my garage 100 times, with only the sleeping jars of jam as my audience. I would not stumble. I turned my head slightly, my eyes finding Chloe in the crowd. She flinched, as if I'd physically struck her. "First," I said, my voice clear and cold, a stark contrast to the warm, bubbly Prosecco everyone was holding. EMCOR's CFO, Chloe, is being terminated, effective immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Her termination is for cause, specifically for embezzling over $80,000 for personal marketing expenses, which included spa treatments, designer handbags, and multiple vacations to Cabo. I didn't need to raise my voice. The microphone did the work for me, turning my quiet declaration into a public indictment. I saw a few people in the crowd reflexively pull out their phones, their screens glowing as they started to record. Chloe's face went from shocked white to a blotchy, furious red. "That is a lie," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "That's an outrageous, slanderous lie." "Is it?" I asked calmly. I didn't even look at her. Instead, I nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture toward the back of the room. Two men, broad-shouldered and impassive in ill-fitting black suits, detached themselves from the wall. They were not caterers. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, their eyes locked on Chloe. Jessica had arranged for them. She'd called them transition specialists. As they began to weave through the stunned crowd, I turned my attention to Mark. His shock had finally curdled into a dark, crimson rage. His eyes, which moments ago had been shining with triumph, were now narrowed slits of pure fury. "Second," I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more direct, aimed right at him. "Mark is also being removed as CEO for gross mismanagement of company assets." That broke his paralysis. "You can't do this," he snarled, lunging forward and grabbing my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. His face was inches from mine, twisted in a mask of disbelief and betrayal. "This is my company. I built this." For years that grip would have terrified me, silenced me. But the woman he was grabbing, the quiet, accommodating Sarah, didn't exist anymore. She had been boiled away over a low, simmering heat of 1,000 small disrespects. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I simply looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his eyes. "You built nothing," I said, my voice a low, dangerous whisper that the microphone barely caught. "You cashed my checks." With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I pulled my arm free from his grasp. The suddenness of the movement made him stumble back a step. I turned back to the microphone, to the silent, watching crowd. "And finally," I announced, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. "As of this moment, EMCOR Solutions is being dissolved. As the sole owner of its assets, including the North Star contract and all intellectual property, I will be selling them directly to North Star in a private deal that was finalized this afternoon." That was the kill shot. The company wasn't just being taken from him, it was ceasing to exist. The dream he'd sold to everyone in this room, the dream he'd built on my back, had just vanished into thin air. The security guards had reached Chloe. One of them murmured something in her ear, and she began to struggle, her corporate composure finally giving way to raw, cornered panic. Mark stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He looked like a fish pulled from the water, gasping in an element it couldn't comprehend. "Security," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. "Please escort both of them out." The second guard moved toward the stage. Mark didn't resist. He was utterly broken. The two guards flanked them, one on each of their arms, and began to walk them toward the exit. It was a slow, humiliating procession. Every eye, every phone camera, followed them as they were marched past the untouched appetizers, past the cheap Prosecco, past the faces of the colleagues and investors they had just been celebrating with. They were no longer the stars of the show. They were the evening's entertainment. Just before he passed through the doors, Mark looked back at me one last time, his eyes hollow with a dawning, terrible understanding. Then he was gone. I stood alone on the stage, the heavy microphone in my hand. The room was a sea of stunned faces. I had done it. The payback was complete, and in the ringing silence, for the first time in 15 years, I could finally hear myself think. The thought that came through, loud and clear, wasn't one of triumph or revenge. It was simple, quiet, and utterly liberating. Now, the real work begins. The 2 months that followed were a blur of focused, relentless activity. There were no more late nights hiding in the garage. My war room moved to a sunlit corner office in Jessica Thorne's law firm, a space that smelled of lemon polish and expensive paper. We worked with the efficiency of a demolition crew, dismantling the hollow structure of MCOR solutions piece by piece. Lawyers spoke in the calm, lethal language of contracts and clauses. Accountants unearthed the full extent of Chloe's creative marketing and Mark's gross negligence. Chloe, faced with the ironclad evidence of wire fraud, took a plea deal that involved a hefty restitution. I knew she couldn't pay and a period of house arrest. She would trade her Gucci for an ankle monitor. The assets of MCOR, which were really just the North Star contract and the analytics software I had paid for, were liquidated and absorbed into my own company in a deal so clean and profitable it made the business section of the local paper. Mark had simply vanished. He moved out while I was at a meeting, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said only, "I need some time." The house felt bigger, quieter. I filled the silence not with sadness, but with the sounds of my own life. The hum of the jam cauldrons, the ringing of my business line, the laughter of my children who seemed lighter, happier, in the new, uncomplicated atmosphere. Then one Tuesday morning, a text message appeared on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. "Can we talk?" It was him. I didn't feel anger or pity. I just felt tired. But I knew this was the last loose thread, the final entry in the ledger. I texted back a time and a place, choosing a small, neutral coffee shop halfway between the house and his parents' place, where I assumed he was staying. I got there first. The woman who walked into that coffee shop was not the same one who had stood silently at that craft fair months ago. I had traded my faded cardigans for a sharp, tailored blazer. My hair was cut in a style that meant business. The exhaustion that had been my constant companion for years was gone, replaced by a clear-eyed energy. I ordered a black coffee, sat at a small table in the corner, and waited. He was late. When he finally walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. The confident, swaggering CEO was gone. The man shuffling toward my table looked deflated, like a balloon a week after the party. His designer suit was replaced by a wrinkled polo shirt and jeans. He hadn't shaved in a few days, and there were dark, hollowed-out circles under his eyes. He looked older, smaller. He slid into the chair opposite me, avoiding my gaze, his eyes fixed on the salt shaker on the table. "Thanks for meeting me," he mumbled. "Mark," I said. It wasn't a question or an accusation, just a statement of fact. A waitress came over, and he ordered a coffee, his voice so low she had to ask him to repeat himself. The silence after she left was thick and uncomfortable. He fiddled with a sugar packet, tearing the paper into tiny, useless strips. Finally, he spoke, his eyes still glued to the table. "Sarah, I don't know what to say. Chloe's facing charges. I'm ruined." He said the word ruined with a kind of detached wonder, as if he were describing a stranger. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was hot and bitter and real. "You ruined yourself, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but firm. There was no anger in it. It was a simple diagnosis. "You flew too close to the sun on wings you didn't build." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading, searching my face for a flicker of the old Sarah, the one who would soothe him, the one who would make it all okay. He didn't find her. "How could you do it?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "How could you humiliate me like that? In front of everyone." Humiliate you. I set my cup down, the small clink of ceramic on saucer the only sound between us. You mean, how could I tell the truth? You stood on that stage and took credit for a company you didn't build, funded by money you didn't earn, and you called my life's work a hobby. I leaned forward slightly. You didn't see me as a partner. You saw me as an appliance. A free one. The waitress brought his coffee. He just stared into the black liquid as if it held the answers to the universe. All those years, he said, his voice barely audible. That money, from your grandmother, it paid for everything, didn't it? The servers, the software, my salary. It wasn't a question. It was a confession. Yes, I said. He shook his head slowly, a dawning horror spreading across his face. It was the look of a man who has been sleepwalking his entire life and has just woken up at the edge of a cliff. I didn't see it. He finally met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw genuine, soul-crushing shame. No, he corrected himself, his voice breaking. That's not true. I didn't want to see it. Because if I saw it, if I admitted it, then I wasn't the hero. I wasn't the self-made man. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. I was just the guy with the rich wife. There it was. The truth. The ugly, simple, unvarnished truth he had spent years avoiding. He hadn't just disrespected me, he had built his entire identity on a foundation of my silence. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't say anything at all. There was nothing left to say. The lesson had been delivered. I reached into my purse, pulled out a $10 bill and placed it on the table. It was more than enough to cover both our coffees. A final, small, insignificant transfer. "Goodbye, Mark," I said. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked out of the dim coffee shop, leaving him there with his lukewarm coffee and his cold, hard truth. The bell on the door chimed softly as I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. I didn't look back. I didn't look back. Walking out into that bright afternoon sun felt like stepping into a different world, one where the air was cleaner and the path forward was my own. I left the ghost of my old life sitting in that coffee shop, and I never saw him again. Because the funny thing about ghosts is that they only have power in the dark, forgotten corners you're too afraid to clean out. Once you throw open the windows and let the light in, they just disappear. 6 months later, I threw open a whole wall of windows. My new office wasn't in a dusty garage. It was on the 7th floor of a new glass and steel building downtown. It had a view that stretched all the way to the hazy blue line of the hills. The air didn't smell of simmering fruit and vinegar. It smelled of fresh coffee, whiteboard markers, and the clean electric hum of possibility. The sign on the frosted glass door didn't say M-Core Solutions. It said Heartland Global Foods. My little hobby had outgrown the garage. I sat at the head of a long, polished oak table. Around it sat my new team, a sharp-eyed CFO named Maria who could spot a padded expense report from a mile away, a young, hungry marketing director who spoke in a rapid-fire language of analytics and engagement, and a head of logistics who managed a fleet of actual delivery vans, not just a single, dented minivan. They weren't my cheerleaders, they were my colleagues. And they looked at me not as a cute hobbyist, but as their boss. On the table in front of us were the new product lines we were about to launch. My original peach bourbon jam was still there, the anchor of it all. But now it sat beside a fiery ghost pepper salsa, a savory tomato basil pasta sauce, and a line of organic fruit preserves destined for the shelves of Whole Foods. Each jar was a testament to the work, the real work, that had been happening in the shadows for years. "The initial order from the Midwest distributor is double our projection," Maria said, tapping her tablet. "If we can scale production to meet it, our Q4 revenue will put us in an entirely new bracket." I looked at the numbers on the screen in front of me. The clean, upward trajectory of our sales chart. It was a beautiful sight. For a fleeting second, the image of Mark's whiteboard flashed in my mind, with his scrawled buzzwords and imaginary hockey stick growth curves. This was different. This was real. This was profit and loss. This was a sustainable model. My grandmother's voice was a warm, steady presence in the back of my mind. This was my garden, and it was thriving. After the meeting, I walked through the open plan office. People were on the phone, typing at their keyboards, collaborating. It was a hive of quiet, focused energy, an engine I had built. My engine. I grabbed my purse and my car keys from my office and headed for the parking garage. My footsteps echoed in the cool concrete space. I walked past a row of Teslas and Audis and stopped at my own spot. The dented, wounded Honda Odyssey was long gone, traded in for a pittance. In its place was a brand new, deep blue Volvo SUV. It was the safest car on the market. It didn't have a peeling steering wheel or a single mysterious stain. The transmission didn't clunk. The air inside smelled of new leather, not old French fries. I'd bought it with the first big check from the North Star deal. It wasn't a monument to motherhood. It was a statement of independence. I got in, the engine starting with a soft, confident purr, and drove out into the city. My destination was a place that used to fill me with a low-grade dread: Costco. The scene of the crime, where my old van had received its permanent scar. The place that represented the endless, thankless cycle of domestic restocking. But today, I wasn't there for juice boxes or family-sized bags of pretzels. I walked past the giant teddy bears and the flat-screen TVs and pushed a large, flatbed cart toward the business supply section. I loaded it with cases of copy paper, boxes of coffee pods for the office break room, a new ergonomic chair for our receptionist, and a pallet of bottled water for the warehouse. I was stocking my company. I was providing for my employees. As I was checking out, I saw them. Stacked high on a display near the registers were cases of my own product, Heartland Jams, artisanal gift pack. My logo, the one I had designed on my old desktop, was looking back at me under the harsh fluorescent lights. A woman picked up a box, examined it, and placed it in her cart. It was the most surreal, most satisfying moment of my life. I paid with my corporate American Express card, the transaction approved in a blink. Pushing the heavy cart out into the parking lot, I navigated to my shiny blue, undented car. As I loaded the boxes into the spacious trunk, I thought about Mark and his condescending words. About Chloe and her petty insults. They thought my passion was small. They thought my work was a hobby. They never understood that the whole time they were building their fragile house of cards, I was in the garage, forging the foundations of an empire, one jar of jam at a time. I closed the trunk, got into the driver's seat, and drove away, a successful business owner leaving Costco. And this time, I was the one who was taking care of business. And I realized the business was never just about jam or corporate takeovers. It was the business of taking care of myself. For years, I learned a hard lesson. Being a silent partner often just means being silent while someone else tells your story for you, usually in a way that makes you a footnote. I was waiting for Mark to see my worth, to acknowledge my contribution, when I should have been the one writing my own invoices all along. They thought my power came from my grandmother's money, from the digits glowing on the screen of the Eliza's trust account. But they were wrong. The money was just the seed. My real power was in my grandmother's worn-out recipe book, in the resilience she taught me, in the patience it takes to turn something raw and sour into something sweet and lasting. The jam was never the hobby. It was the proof. The whole time they were building a fantasy on a flimsy foundation, I was building an empire on solid ground. So let me ask you, if life has handed you a brand new, unwritten page, would you have the courage to turn to it? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the hardest of times.